All right, now I would like to discuss the art of the great Swiss painter Arnold Bocklin, and this is a self-portrait of him here. His dates are 1846, or rather 1827 to 1901. And so we started in the previous video series on Caspar David Friedrich, basically inaugurating the epoch of German Romantic art that goes all the way down here to Bocklin and also to Franz Stuck, who goes down to, I think, 1921. So that will bring us to the end of the complete development of German Romantic art, especially its mythological aspects. Bocklin is a mythological painter, and his work also can be divided into three epochs. The first, like Friedrich, but except that it's the exact inverse opposite process. What happens? Whereas we saw with Friedrich that he began in the dream world, and then in the mid-career moved into the waking world, what Spengler would call Wachsein, which is waking being, in opposition to his use of the word Dasein, which Heidegger got from him but completely used it in a different way. Heidegger means Dasein is just you there in a particular time and place doing a particular task, worlding, it's self plus world. Spengler doesn't mean it that way. Spengler opposes Dasein to Wachsein insofar as you have waking being versus the being there-ness of instinctive life that brings flowers up out of the ground, grass up out of the ground, trees out of the ground, animals have instincts, the genitals, the circulation of the blood, all these instinctive forces that know how to build things and don't require instruction from the brain, from the neocortex, or even a waking animal consciousness. So this is the opposition, and so we could say with Caspar David Friedrich, he began with Dasein, with being, then moved into Wachsein, then went back to Dasein, again, to the mythological realm. With Bocklin, it's the opposite. He begins as a realist painter, a landscape painter, as we'll see here. In this video, I want to go through the first phase, the Wachsein phase, which then, after his journeys to Rome, he was born in Basel, trained in Dusseldorf and Paris, and then went to Rome. And in Rome, the classical collective unconscious slowly seeps into his work, seeps in bit by bit by bit, as we'll see, and then eventually completely invades it by the second epoch, which is the epoch of his mastery, his high period, 1865 to 1886. And this is the Dasein period. And the way Spengler uses the word Dasein is pretty much exactly equivalent to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, which has to do with instincts within us that produce mythological images. Dreams are the personal myths, whereas the collective myths are public dreams. And so then with the third epoch, he moves back into Wachsein. So he goes from, which is 1886 to 1901, so he does the exact opposite of what Caspar David Friedrich does, as we'll see here. So now let's take a look at, I want to bring in Spengler again here for this morphological analogy, where Spengler talks about when a civilization, or a culture rather, begins to move into its civilization phase, it begins to produce art that is hysterical, that is bombastic, that is excessive, that is based on nerve excitement, melodrama, sensationalism, and so forth. And he says this is the art of the Hellenistic period of Pergamon. Pergamon is exactly equivalent, he says, to Wagner. Wagner's music fits all of those descriptions, all those adjectives, as does Pergamon. And they are morphologically, they occur at the same point of time with respect to each civilization. This is what the Pergamon altar would have looked like in the center of the city. But let's take a look at the reliefs here. The relief sculpture. This is it's the Gigantomachy from Hesiod here, and it is very dramatic, based on sensationalism, nervous crowd excitement. This is Hecate fighting against Clytius and Artemis against Otos. These are titans and giants from the underworld. Here is Athena and Nike. Athena here and Nike over here fighting Alcyonius, and then Gaia is herself coming up out of the underworld here. This is not Winckelmann's world of noble simplicity and calm grandeur. This isn't 5th century Athens anymore with its calm, cool, collected statues. This is melodrama. Here's Sibylle riding on a lion, and then we have Nereus, Doris, a giant, Nereus, Doris, a giant, and Oceanus, all fighting. And then the three Moirai even get in on the action. The three Fates are fighting against Agrios and Thoas, a couple of more giants. And then here's a couple of more pictures of their relief. So what I want to say in bringing this up is that the spirit of Bocklin is exactly analogous to this and to Wagner's music. Wagner and Bocklin are doing the exact same thing, pretty much at the same time. Wagner dies in 1883. The Ring cycle dates mostly from the late 50s and through the 60s. Tristan is 1859. This is Bocklin's Battle of the Centaurs from his middle period, harkening back to Michelangelo's Battle of the Centaurs, but also very much in the spirit of Pergamon. And also, as we'll see, Sperlanga with this image. The Sperlanga dates later from the time of Tiberius, but it's meant to be Neo-Hellenistic, and it's evocative of the Pergamon altar. So here's Polyphemus. This is one of his late paintings, Bocklin's late paintings. This is his most famous painting, Isle of the Dead. And all this melodrama, nervous excitement, dragons and nymphs and fauns, a very kitschy version of the Birth of Venus here, and Odysseus and Calypso, and then this crazy thing with all these Nereids and Tritons doing somersaults and playing in the water, and so that's the nervous excitement, the Wagnerian equivalent, the bombastic style of this kind of art, which is great, and nonetheless, it's decadent to the marrow, not a question about that, but it's a lot of fun. So let's look at the evolution of Bocklin's three phases, and for the rest of this video, I want to go over the first phase. He starts off being trained at Dusseldorf here between, I think it's 1845 to 49, I believe. And this is a picture that dates from that period, a mountain lake. There are influences of Caspar David Friedrich's landscape, romantic landscape painting on him here. Here's another one. He starts out as a realist, as a landscape painter, painting realistic landscapes. This is his Vauxhall mode. He starts out with waking being, as we have said. This is a landscape with a waterfall, 1849. And then when he moves to Rome, he goes down to Rome then from 1850 to 1856. And he starts at first innocently painting these Roman landscapes. This is the Pontic swamps. And then pretty soon he will slowly be invaded by the classical collective unconscious. Basically, what we talked about with Goethe, the entire world of the classical Walpurgisnacht sneaks in bit by bit into his realist world of Vauxhall, of waking being. And it starts here with this little tiny figure in this landscape, which is almost certainly a nymph. I can't imagine that he would paint a woman with her pants half down and her ass hanging out, unless it was a nymph, because that gives you an excuse then to represent, it's a nymph, it's not pornography. And then, so now what happens then, note, is that the mythological figures appear very tiny, and they're going to grow larger and larger and larger until they completely invade and take over the landscapes. Here he's been trained as a landscape painter, so the emphasis is still on the landscape as this little nymph innocently strides by. And then here is a centaur and a nymph, centaur and a nymph. They are still small, larger than that previous figure. The trees and foliage still dominate. And note too that the trees and the foliage can also be looked at as a kind of symbol of the collective unconscious, the Dasein world, the plant world, the instinctive ground of being. So these creatures are coming out of that world. They're coming out of the collective unconscious, the world of Dasein. Spengler's Dasein, not Heidegger's. The being there-ness. And so too, now we get with this Pan amongst the reeds of 1857, it starts coming in, the collective unconscious creatures. Now they're larger, but still embedded within foliage. And they creep up on his stage. Here is Pan frightening a shepherd. So he's still lurking up here around the periphery, and the real beings from the real world are being threatened now by incursions, let's say, from the collective unconscious. I love this painting. It's great. And then now they're getting larger and larger. This is a Pan whistling at a blackbird. I believe this is 1858, 59. I think it's 58. There's two versions of this. This sort of casual Pan whistling at the realist world. It's a very casual invasion. It's not dramatic at first. And then, so now his actual art style itself has not yet matured at this point. This is the early version of Villa by the Sea, and he does several of these. But when he, in 1865, does this one with a mythological character, this is Iphigenia, from Iphigenia, the woman who had to be sacrificed by her father Agamemnon in order for the winds to blow the ships so that they could get the game on and go to Troy, so that they had to sacrifice her. But here she is in a melancholy mode, and this is the crystallization right here from this point on, 1865. He's back and forth between Munich and Rome during this whole period, and the Roman, or rather the classical unconscious, has completely invaded his waking being, waking mode of consciousness. But this photorealistic style that he has. Now, the art critic Heinrich Wölfflin wrote an excellent book called Principles of Art History, where he made a distinction in art between linear styles and painterly styles. Linear styles are the chiseled Renaissance styles of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. Those are linear because all the forms are in sharp, crystal clear focus. But once the brushstroke starts to enter in, which it does with Titian, let's say in the north, in Venice, once that starts to enter in, it gradually dissolves and disintegrates forms, and the brushstroke predominates. So let's say Impressionism is a painterly style, whereas this style is linear. It's in the tradition because he's been down in Italy, in Rome, studying Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican, studying Michelangelo, and that world, that becomes his aesthetic. And it becomes almost a kind of photorealistic aesthetic here. And this is it. From this point on, this will be his art style. You're not going to see the brushstroke until the style begins to disintegrate in the third period. And then so we have here it is. This is the Lament of the Shepherd, where now the classical mythological forms have taken over completely. No more landscape painting. For the most part, these figures now will dominate his art from here all the way to the end. And what will happen, you can sort of see a little bit of it here, that will shift in the third period back to Dasein, because here at this point he is shifting now into the Dasein world of the collective mythological unconscious, which occupies the period of his maturity as an artist for between 1865 and 1886. That's his high period. And during these first two periods, the first epoch of Wachsein and the second epoch of Dasein, he's poor. He's living with his wife. They have 14 children. He loses half of them. And they're poor for the whole period. It's not until really the third period, the 1880s, that he became famous. And by the end of the century, he had become Germany's most famous artist. And so his career also is the inverse of Friedrich's, whereas we saw Friedrich started out with lots of fame and approbation and then wound up in his third period pretty much living in poverty. The situation is the inverse with Bocklin. And so this is the world of Bocklin. And now, so what I was going to hint at, what happens, the disintegrative element in the third period that brings him back to what I call Wachsein Redux, is that there is a slight kitschy element here. We saw the kitsch with the Birth of Venus. And the kitsch is at first, it's slight, it's subtle, it's there, but it doesn't dominate until later. We saw one of the paintings back there with, what was it, the nymphs playing. There's a very strong kitschy element here from the high middle period with the cupids hovering around Venus. And let's see, I think it was, but the kitsch elements take over and they become stronger and stronger and stronger. I think this is 1886, so this ends in the middle period and announces the decay. The kitsch element gets up over the top and it completely takes control of the art and disintegrates it. with kitsch and sentimentality, which invades now in the third period. He had an invasion from the collective unconscious in the transition to the first and second period. Now he has an invasion from the Vox sign realm of waking being, because in the third period, because kitsch and sentimentality aren't proper to dreams. If you think about your dreams, there's no kitsch in your dreams. There's no sentimentality in your dreams. Those are inferior emotions, and they are sarcastic and ironic aspects of the waking consciousness, the waking mind, which begins to analyze the art, make fun of it, make lots of jokes. It is fun and funny, but it's also kitschy, and it's also now the waking being coming back in and taking back over. Once the kitsch completely takes over his art, it pretty much destroys it. So that's the opening video on the very great artist Arnold Bocklin.